Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Live at 5 tour. I am your host, curator Kevin Adkisson with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And I hope that everyone is having a wonderful new year, a start of 2021. I hope you had a safe and happy holiday. I know that I did with some family visiting here to Cranbrook. We did not get to stay in the Smith house, unfortunately. And so I thought that I would come over today and check on the house in this snowy weather. And based off of some audience suggestions, my sister requested that I talk about some of the building systems here at the Frank Lloyd Wright Smith House and how those differ from building systems in the houses that are probably more similar to what all of you live in. So if you are new to Live at 5, or if you missed some of the Frank Lloyd Wright house tours, there are older videos both here on the Instagram channel and on the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research Facebook page that talk about the story of the Smith house and Melvin and Sarah Smith and their remarkable dream that made this house a reality. But today I'm going to be talking just about Frank Lloyd Wright and some of his really unique construction ideas. So our little Smith house here, the Smiths moved in 1950, and the house is part of a long tradition of what Frank Lloyd Wright called his solution to the American small house problem. And he called these houses Usonian, which was his abbreviation for United States of North America. And he did a little more than 24 Usonian houses between his first, the Jacobs House of 1936, and World War II. The Smith House is pretty interesting because it is conceived during World War II and it's constructed after, but it really has this sort of early Usonian principles. Later on, as they expanded and this sort of idea of a kit house really developed, the Usonians became more standardized and also different. And so today we're going to be talking about what makes our Usonian house unique from the sort of standpoint of construction and design. And a lot of the details that we're seeing were worked out in the 1930s, and then he sort of kept working on them all the way through 1959, when he died at the age of 93. So the first thing you notice being a Michigander, or if you are a Michigander, or if you're from any sort of place with weather, is that we have a flat roof. And the flat roofs were, I think, integral to Frank Lloyd Wright's design idea that these houses would be one with the land. And so you see the way that it's a relatively very flat ridge, but it creates this line across picked up by the junipers. And then the flat roof is absolutely vital to create this line shooting across the property and being picked up by the brick property wall there. But how do you actually keep a flat roof from leaking? And the original roofing system here on the house would have been a combination of canvas, fiberglass, and metal flashing. There was also at one point a tar paper roof on the house. Mr. Smith still struggled with leaks and he put a wet tar roof, which was a pretty terrible idea, and we're still suffering the consequences of his wet tar roof because the wet tar leaks through the house. Today it has a rubber membrane. So I think the flat roofs are really where design is winning out over practicality. But Frank Lloyd Wright, he had more than just design on his mind. It was also a sort of what were attics for? Well, they were expensive to heat, they were places for clutter, so they were unnecessary. And so if he was designing a sort of economical house for the middle class, then eliminating the attic to Wright had a real sort of purpose. Now, what's interesting about the scale of the roof, as we look through these two clear story windows, you see how you can just see straight through the house. And so the thickness of the roof is only 1 foot from the sort of interior ceiling until the roof. So if I tilt my camera up, you can see our membrane roof structure here. And the flashing is relatively shallow. And so the whole roof structure, it's just this 1 foot of space. And the way that Frank Lloyd Wright achieves that is by what he called stitching together 2x4s. And so he would run 2x4s along the length of the house, and he would triple them up. So there are 3 2x4s, and each one would end, and the next one would continue, and then where it ended, the next one continued. And so he would stitch 2x4s in order to create this very thin, very flat roof. Now, a more perhaps traditional way of building a roof after the 80s would be balloon framing, and so you would have balloon frame walls and then you would have stud roofs, and that's where you just take a 2x4 and you would just run across the entire house up to the ridge beam of the home, and then you would cover those with either plywood or with thin strips of wood, and then you would layer your waterproofing, your asphalt, or your slate shingles. Frank Lloyd Wright sort of does away with all of that, and he gives us this sashed, or rather stitched 2x4 interior construction in this very, very thin plane. And the way it sheds water is just by having very low. It is angled, so it is a pitched roof, and then everything is angled down to these drains. And so the water comes out, and it's dropping here in the carport. It doesn't quite matter where it drops. We'll see at other corners of the house where today you probably wouldn't want to have the water be draining so close to the foundation. But we'll talk about how he's building the foundation here next. So it is a concrete slab. We might call this this sort of footing slab a slab. Frank Lloyd Wright called it the floor mat. In most houses, especially ones built in a cold climate like this, your foundation is going to run below the frost line. And you do that for waterproofing. You do it for the stability of the house, so the house doesn't freeze and thaw. You want the house to be rooted below where water is penetrating and freezing. Frank Lloyd Wright, however, does not go above the frost line. He simply floats the house. And so he floats it by building a bed of gravel. And the gravel would be raked so that it was also draining. So underneath this concrete, you excavated a flat surface and then you raked it out. You added gravel and you continued raking. And then you poured the concrete of the slab, and it's held within this brick frame. Now, I don't know how much structure the brick is doing. I mean, I know it's doing nothing because you can see how it's cracked. But the brick is a way that Frank Lloyd Wright envisioned that you would actually cast the concrete into the brick. Now, I don't think that is what the Smiths were doing, because there is this mortar line that would have been impossible to create had the floor slab been cast within the brick molding. So it's likely that they framed up with wood and then cast the concrete to build the house. But what it means is that you're above the frost line, there is no basement, and you essentially are sitting on what an architect or an engineer would call a thermal mass. And it is nice to come into the house and get myself on top of this thermal mass, even though the porch actually is radiating heat because it's one sheet of concrete that's going out. What you have inside is a system with no radiators, no piping, no air ventilation. It's just this one solid, beautiful hunk of concrete. And inside of this concrete at our house are copper pipes that are circulating hot water. In the original designs, they were using iron pipes, but they had a number of problems at one of the Usonian houses in suburban Boston, where in the construction of the house, the iron piping was breaking in the freeze-thaw cycle. So copper is more malleable. It's also more ductile. And so that is a better way of getting the heat into the concrete than the iron. And of course, unless you are watching me from Japan, where you might have a heated floor, or South Korea has a tradition of heated floors, or if you have just a wonderful luxurious bathroom, you are probably not heating your house with gravity heat. It is something that it comes from the Far East, many centuries old in Asian architecture. Frank Lloyd Wright would have experienced it in 1905 when he visited Japan for the first time. And he really thought that it was solving multiple solutions. It was solving the practical problem of how do you heat a house. But for him, it also solved a problem of, if you're building a house for the middle class, the small house problem, do you really want to be spending space on a huge system of pipes and boilers? And do you want to be spending the cost of building things like radiator covers and vent grills? And so he eliminates all of this service idea of having any sort of utility system by putting it all within the concrete floor. And that's, I think, an idea that we don't explore as much with Frank Lloyd Wright in his architecture. We don't think of him in the same way that we might those sort of German modernists like Walter Gropius, where the architecture is a factory and the architecture is performing like a machine. But Frank Lloyd Wright really is thinking of these Usonian houses in that same language. Now, he doesn't write about them like that. He doesn't conceive of them. He's all about organic architecture, American architecture. But when he describes why he chose to do gravity heat systems in the floors here, it very much is a sort of practical way of making the house function more like a machine and reducing all of these unnecessary fittings like radiators and vents and above ground pipes. Now, of course, the curse is if the floor messes up, there's nothing you can do. The entire house is built on top of the heating system and it's entirely sunk within the concrete. And in the only book that explores the construction of these houses, the author, who was a graduate student in the 70s, interviewed homeowners, and so many of them expressed to Frank Lloyd Wright himself, we really don't want to do this. This sounds like a terrible idea as far as the longevity of the house. And Frank Lloyd Wright, the ever charming and demanding architect that he was, just insisted that this was how you heated the house. And to my knowledge, in that book at least, most of the homeowners were very satisfied with it. I think the Frank Lloyd Wright Smith house may be rather unusual in that our 6-zone heated floor is still functioning in all 6 zones. A lot of them you have where parts of the house no longer are circulating the water. So not only are we sitting on Frank Lloyd Wright's beloved floor mat of heating system, and you'll see that it does just extend right through the windows out to the steps there. And so you'll see that it rarely does snow stick onto this floor, because even though the heating isn't going outside, you're creating this thermal mass where you heat up this hunk of concrete and it's going to stay hot throughout the day. If we had someone living here, the way that Frank Lloyd Wright and many of the early homeowners discovered the best way of maximizing the potential of the floor was, unlike your home heating system where you might have it on in the evening and turn it way down when you go to bed. Here, the floor system was meant to be turned on at midnight, and you kept it running until about 4 p.m. And then that would heat it up for the comfort of your evening, and then you would heat it up again at the coldest part of the night. And then it just holds the heat during the day. And one benefit of that system is that you can actually open all the doors and windows. You'll replace the air, get fresh breezes, and then as soon as you close them, you're immediately starting to reheat the house. And so a lot of the homeowners describe that as being a very different feeling, that the sort of temperature in the room is cooler than you might expect. But because your feet are warm, and because the warmth is so present evenly throughout the whole house, it is a very comfortable way of living. Let's see, what else about the floor? The 2x4 foot grid that you're seeing scored into the house is the way that Frank Lloyd Wright dimensioned the project. And so he would start at the drafting table by starting with the 2x4 foot grid. Lumber and supplies are going to fit within that 2x4 foot grid. So if you have an 8 foot length of pipe, you know exactly how many you need to order to cover this amount of space. That also then fits the furniture. So all of the Frank Lloyd Wright design furniture is fitting on the grid. Things like the couch cushions are on the grid. The bookshelves are on the grid. Even things like the screws are all placed within the grid coming up from the floor. But one thing you might not know, I've not talked about it on Live at 5, is that Frank Lloyd Wright also did not provide dimensions on his architectural drawings. He thought that if you were the contractor and you had the floor plan of this house and it had the 2x4 foot grid, well, then you could build the house because every dimension is coming off of that grid. And so why would he provide a sort of more conventional set of construction drawings that actually told you how wide the door was? You could just relate it to the floor. Now, in practice, that meant that you had the contractor, or in the case of Mr. Smith, who built the house himself, making these decisions on site of how exactly you join two things together, because Frank Lloyd Wright didn't actually detail the project any more than saying this is where it goes. And there's always going to be a little bit of sort of field conditions that aren't quite understandable in paper until you have them in concrete, wood, and brick. And so that was a sort of endless point of contention between Frank Lloyd Wright and the contractors, because this happened on so many of his projects, where they would ask for more detailed drawings, and he would say, you have the grid on the floor, you should be able to build the house. Why are you such a terrible builder? Now, if you have questions, be sure to type them in as we continue our journey talking about some of the construction features here in the Frank Lloyd Wright Smith House. The next feature, after you have constructed your floor mat, the great concrete floor, then you would think it would be time to build the walls. And you'd be partly correct. Frank Lloyd Wright next wanted you to construct the brick walls, the masonry walls, as well as all of the vertical elements of the window frame, and then you build the roof. And it's only after you build those brick walls and the window frames and you have the roof floating that you're given this sort of primitive workshop on site from which you could build the rest of the house. And so it's underneath the roof that you were meant to then build these board and batten wooden walls. And I think I've talked about the board and batten wooden walls probably on a dozen Live at 5, so I won't focus too much on these, except that to point out just how unusual this is relative from, most likely, unless you're watching from another Frank Lloyd Wright house, you are not sitting in a board and batten house right now. The walls are incredibly thin. They're made up of just 5 layers of materials, starting with a cypress board here, a 1-foot board to a 1-inch batten, so a 1-foot 1-inch module. Behind this is a membrane. In the case of this wall, it's a Tyvek membrane. Originally would have been a tar paper membrane, but it's been replaced. Then a sheet of plywood, another membrane, and then another sheet of cypress, another board of cypress. Frank Lloyd Wright thought that it was fireproof, rodent-proof, and waterproof. All of those are partly true, none of which are fully true. But this very thin construction that has no vertical elements, you almost have to think of it like building a boat. It really is not like other architectural construction, and it's getting its strength from 2 places. One, the corner. So think about folding a sheet of paper or a paper fan. It's going to get much stronger when you fold it, and so that is providing a lot of strength. And then the second source are the horizontal elements. So the bench here is working to support the lower part of the wall, and then the bookshelves here are acting almost like I-beams, or they're turning the wall itself into a very large I-beam. And so the bookshelves not only prevent you from hanging paintings, which Frank Lloyd Wright thought most people had terrible taste in art, but they are also providing you functional space to store books or linens. In the case of the Smiths, by the 1970s, they've replaced all of their books with works of ceramics from Cranbrook students and other shops. But those shelves are also providing the support for the board and batten wall. Let's see. I see that my sister has joined us for the tour, so if she has anything she wants me to talk about in greater detail, feel free to type something in. If anyone has any questions, I am your curator, Kevin Adkisson, and we're talking today a little bit about construction details at the Frank Lloyd Wright Smith House and how the house is different from houses that you might live in, or apartments. One thing that a lot of people notice, especially kids, when I do tours for them and ask them, how is this different from your house? There's no chandelier here in the dining room. And that's really not a Frank Lloyd Wright thing. Chandeliers in the dining room are really a colonial revival invention. You don't see them till the late 19th century, and then they become pretty standard in dining rooms in the 20th century. But before that, the idea of a chandelier in a domestic space would have not been, chandeliers were palace architecture and public architecture. And so the fact that there is no hanging fixture in the dining room is really not a radical shift. What is unusual is the building in of the light fixture in the house. In the earliest Usonian houses, Frank Lloyd Wright, he tried to centralize the wiring so that all of the wires were coming out of the central brick core, which consists of the kitchen and the boiler room. Later, he would change that and he would allow more wiring. But in earliest Usonians, you would actually just have a piece of copper piping, a conduit, and the light bulbs would just be screwed in along it. It looks pretty rough and ready, rather Bauhausian. Here, you get a much more refined light fixture. But where these lights are actually running are in between those stitched 2x4s. So there are 3 2x4s right here, and there are 3 2x4s right here. Those are supporting the weight of the roof. And then that 1 foot of clearance between the membrane that's sitting with snow right now, and then the cypress board that is the finished ceiling surface, these light bulbs are existing within that space. And if I had thought about this, I would have moved one for you, because it is kind of cool that you can just see into the house. I mean, this thing is so thinly built. It is amazing how comfortable it is for being such a real sort of minimalist construction. Now, the ceiling in the kitchen goes up so high in order to take all the smells of the kitchen and have them sort of rise up and leave the house through operable windows above this soffit. How 4'11" Mrs. Smith would ever open those windows, I don't know, but it was his idea of keeping smells within the kitchen that the ceiling goes up. There is no air conditioning in the house. That is a great question. I talked a lot about how the house is heated. The idea of the floor being a thermal mass, it actually works in both directions. So in the winter, you're heating up this concrete and then it just stays hot and the heat radiates off of it. And you can see here where the heat is sort of going out into the unheated patio. You can see exactly how far just the heat from the floor of the inside of the house is radiating through the concrete. Concrete is a great, once you heat up a rock, it stays hot. Think of a pizza stone. It actually works in the summer as well. So in the summer, the ground, the actual gravel bed that the floor is seating on stays cool. And so the concrete stays cool because it never is in direct sunlight. And so when you're here in the summer, when you walk on the floor, it is cool to the touch. And then Frank Lloyd Wright uses a system of eaves and windows and doors to cross-ventilate the house. And so as opposed to when you take a tour of Saarinen House, which was not designed for summer living, the president of the academy was not intended to be in residence in the summer. Saarinen House is miserably hot in the summer, and then you can drive right over here and you'll be perfectly pleasant. Living in a Frank Lloyd Wright house, you are more in touch with nature than you are in a lot of designs. You know when it's cold out, you know when it's raining, you know when it's hot out, but you don't have extremes. He really designs the house to mediate across different weather conditions. And a great example of that is how he would site the house in relation to the sun. So you see this overhang here. If it was a sunny day today, on a midwinter's day, the sun is low in the sky over here. We're facing south, and the sun is going to come in, and the sun will shine all the way across, and it will actually hit the edge of this blue seat. So in the winter, you have sunlight across this whole room. But then in the summer, when the sun is high in the sky, the sun will be way up here out of view, and the sun will shine down, and you will actually not get any sun in the house in July. The sun will be blocked and it will stop right here. And so the house will be much cooler just through that solar gain. And then you'll see there are screens for each of these doors. And so they could open all of these doors with screens. There are screens up here. And so you have the breeze going straight across it. And that's how, when we were doing 18-person tours, you get 18 people in here on a really hot day, and it's not, air conditioned, but it is comfortable. It is very pleasant to be in the house with everything open and the breeze going around. Let's see. Any other questions about the sort of construction and logistics of the house? Is it comfortable? Absolutely. I'll say relative to my campus housing over at Saarinen House, it is much more comfortable in the winter and the summer here as far as extreme temperatures go. Right now, every window in Saarinen House is open because it is so extraordinarily hot from the radiators. So this is a nice change of pace. So I'm not sure what C and R is. Unfortunately, I'm racking my brain. We talked about the wooden walls and wooden construction. We talked about the floor being a heat store with the concrete and the heating. Oh, we got a brand new radiator. So I think Live at 5 needs to see the radiator. This will be our first ever radiator on a Live at 5 tour. So I came into the house a little before the winter holidays, and it was not warm at all, and our radiator broke, and so we've just now installed a new boiler. And so here's our brand new boiler. The last boiler was much larger, but was also built inside of this room as opposed to this one, which was assembled at the factory and shipped here. You just heard it click on. And then do you see all these pipes? So these are the pipes that are going into the floor and heating the house. And so if we look down here, we can actually see the thermal store of the house. And so you see way down there, looks like some of the gravel bed that the house is resting on. And then you see, I don't know, what is that, 10 inches, 12 inches of concrete? And these are the pipes that are headed into the concrete floor. And they just go out to the edge of the house and then circulate back. And I'm not going to touch the pipe to see if it's as hot coming back as it is going out, but it is pretty hot. It is exceptionally hot here in the boiler room. There's some glowing lights in there, some nice LEDs. Oh, yes, compression and release. Thank you. The question was, what about compression and release? That is certainly a feature that you do not have in most houses. Frank Lloyd Wright thought he was so influenced by Asian architecture, and whether that was his experience with Japan at the 1893 World's Fair or with his trips there in 1905 and in the 19-teens. And he really sort of admonished and dismissed any sort of idea of processional architecture. So whether that's a French enfilade or if that is a Georgian center door with 5 windows above, there's very little sort of pretense and pomp in Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture. And he really hated the idea that you would open a front door and understand everything about the house. And so you never open the door in a Frank Lloyd Wright house to a grand hall with the parlor on the left and the dining room on the right. Even when his houses were more formal and were sort of centered on hearths and on formal functional rooms, it was always an unfolding of space. And by this point, by 1950, with the Smith House, he is fully dedicated to this idea of discovery and of compression and release. So you start in the house with the door closed, and you're brought through this very narrow hallway with a low roof. That's my jacket I flung off on the floor, excuse it. And then you're compressed down, and then you are released into this grand, much higher space. And one thing that Frank Lloyd Wright took from sort of Zen Zen principles and Taoist architecture was this idea that nothing could be beautiful that was complete. And so your mind must work to complete the vision. So whether that is the sort of incomplete corner here where your view is extended out and the sort of cubic form of the house is beginning to fall apart, or if that is simply your eye completing the link of the lines of the house to the lines of the lake behind it. That was his way of expressing beauty in the house. And so you are compressed and released, but at the same time, your eye is given these sort of pathways to follow into space. And that was his way of creating beauty and drama. And it's certainly not something that you find in most architecture. Now, the height of the rooms is pretty much proportion to the function. So the ceiling here is very low because you're sitting down. The ceiling over the blue couch is very low because you're seating down. Where you're standing, the ceiling is higher. Where the function demands it, like the kitchen, it's much higher. The bathrooms also have higher ceilings because of the steam from the shower. And so it is an intimate house, but it's really designed unusual in that for a domestic space, the ceiling height is changing at all. And instead of having a sort of piano noble, a principal floor for the family where all the ceilings are higher and then minor floors where all the ceilings are lower, here the ceiling height is changing based off of the individual function of the room. And then as far as storage goes, the storage is all coming from the structure itself. And so there are not really closets in the traditional sense, but you have bookshelves and doored bookcases for storage. And here in Mrs. Smith's study with the wonderful electric light and skylight and window, clear story windows, or in some of the bedrooms where you have very little light, but you actually have the closet is essentially part of the design of the wall. And so you have this wall where the clear story light is coming in above it, and then you can open the wall and you see that the shelves and things continue. And even things like the closet light is actually shining above and below. And so Frank Lloyd Wright is really taking advantage and sort of integrating the closet into the design of the house. So when you turn that light off, you're turning the closet light off as well. I'm very close to the camera. So the bathrooms are kind of kooky. They have this strange little detail here that I don't think is Frank Lloyd Wright. I think that's a Mr. Smith's later addition in the manner of Frank Lloyd Wright. The problem of humidity in the house is a real problem. I mean, I don't have my little humidifier over here, but it is very, very dry in here. Part of the reason why that is okay at the moment, first of all, we haven't worked out a sustainable solution of how to humidify the house. But the other thing is with humidity, as long as you're not doing a radical change, you're actually going to be fine. And so the whole house is so dry, and so everything dries out at once, and then in the summer it all expands with moisture at the same time. A real issue would be is right now if we tried to take some of this furniture from here in the house with 5% humidity to the museum with 70% humidity, that could be really dangerous to the glue joints of this furniture. And so by not actually doing anything with the humidity, we are allowing the house to continue to breathe. It is a challenge that all Frank Lloyd Wright house museums and houses where people live face is how do you deal with this sort of, Frank Lloyd Wright's being fine with that shift in humidity versus a museum where you want it to be in that 68 to 72 range. We don't have works on paper in the house. We don't have paintings in the house, or we don't have many. And so those are not in danger. And then the textiles would love more humidity. But again, we're not making radical shifts. And so the wood is stably changing over the course of the year. And then the ceramics and the metals are just happy as clams, no matter what the humidity is. So I hope this was interesting for Alive at 5, our first of 2021. If you have more requests, be sure to send them in. I do type those up and try and do them. Of course, it is easiest for me as curator of the Center for Collections and Research to take you on the tours where I have the access to, and so that is why we ended up here at the Smith House today. It's the first week back at work. I, wanted to do something that was fun, beautiful, and a little bit easy for me to access. But if you do have other places you want to go, I have been refused. I can't take you in the steam tunnels. I can't take you into the facilities plant, but I did get that request to go over to the Performing Arts Center, and I emailed the head of the Performing Arts Department, so hopefully we'll be there in a few weeks. Remember that there are tours on Facebook on Wednesday at the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research Facebook page, and I'll be back here on Tuesday next week live at 5 o'clock. I'll be on Facebook next Wednesday at 5 o'clock. And don't forget, at the end of the month, January 25th, I think it is, we will start my fourth annual History of American Architecture lecture series. And so it is different from all the ones that came before it, and it will be a virtual series. And so do sign up for that. I love doing these free tours, but if you're able to come and participate in some of our paid programming, that certainly helps with the center's budget. So we appreciate your support watching these tours, and we appreciate your support in buying tickets. Until next time, it's been wonderful talking about some of Frank Lloyd Wright's very unusual, very weird building practices, and I'll leave you with one of the crises of building a building like this is that he had sort of standard sets of drawings, so details and things. He didn't reinvent the wheel every time he would build the house. And when Banks would get these drawings, this is what the floor is going to be like, this is what the walls are going to be like, Banks would just say, absolutely not. It is not going to work. There's going to be no resale value. We are not extending you a loan. And that went all the way up to the federal government. And so a lot of the houses he designed were never built because financing could not be secured, and all of Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian houses had to be financed essentially through non-traditional means, whether that was like the Smiths, where they paid it off by building it themselves and by just scrimping and saving, or whether that was using their own wealth or selling an existing house for cash. And so these construction details, which did not become standardized, really did not become kind of common practice, were really rejected in their day as well by sort of more conservative building professionals and by the financial industry. And so they were experimental, they were his solutions to a lot of times his problems. They do create the Frank Lloyd Wright aesthetic, and they're necessary to create it. You couldn't build this house if the walls were more than 3 inches thick. That is part of being in the house, is how thin the walls are. But they didn't live on after Frank Lloyd Wright's passing. And I did forget to point out here, this is the thickness of all exterior and interior walls. So this is that cypress board, the plywood middle, and the cypress outside. They do have the membrane even on interior walls because it's the only soundproofing from room to room. But this is the same wall construction, the sandwich board construction, that is all the interior and exterior walls. So thanks so much for watching, everyone. This went a lot longer than I thought it would, but you all stuck with me. So be sure to share the videos, like our post, so more people can discover the wonder of Cranbrook. Be safe, be warm, and I will see you all next Tuesday.